accepting our invitation. I'm Rosa Maria Moncada. I'm in charge of the direct mechanism to support countries of the KIX LAC Center. I'm happy to be here with you. We're just getting started. I would like to remind you that we have simultaneous interpreting available into Spanish, English, and French. So please choose your preferred language at the bottom of the screen. So I would like to start with some announcements. As I said, we have interpretation available. We will be working for 3 weeks for today's session. During the presentations, if you have any questions, please share those on the platform chat. So after each block, we will have time for a Q&A so we can hear the potential questions from the audience. We are joined by a variety of stakeholders from the region, ministries of education, civil society organizations, academia, the teachers union, international cooperation agencies, and we are so happy to have you all here because we need different views because that enriches the dialogue. So please, if you can share your name, the institution you work for, and the country you are joining us from. I'm pleased to start this conference that is part of this knowledge mobilization cycle promoted by KIX LAC to promote a culture based on evidence in education in Latin America and the Caribbean. As many of you know, this year we are focusing on teaching practices. For those of you joining us for the first time, I would like to briefly tell you about KIX LAC and what is this knowledge mobilization cycle. The Knowledge and Innovation Exchange Center KIX is a space for collaboration and exchange for innovation in educational in Belize, Dominica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, St. Vincent and Grenadines, and St. Lucia. So I would like to take a moment to thank all of the countries joining us. KIX is promoted by the International Alliance for Education and a Canadian organization, which is the International Development Research Center, IDRC. It's also supported by SUMMA. We are focused here on research, public policy, and educational practice, with a space for conversation when we share evidence, but we also discuss evidence and we use it for decision-making. These mobilization cycles we promote are processes that move throughout the year that start with listening sessions. We had one early this year, and then we continue with conferences, seminars, workshops, with this connection with different institutions and stakeholders that are key and in the region, and also with the dissemination of our products. DP KIX, in collaboration with the IDRC, promotes applied research projects throughout the world to produce the evidence that strengthens educational systems. This is not just about producing knowledge. This is a process that is strictly or deeply connected with the work in education and is focused on promoting changes in policy and practice. In Latin America and the Caribbean, KIX has promoted projects that cover challenges related to teacher professional development, early childhood education, equity, inclusion, educational resilience, and strengthening of the educational system, and better outcomes. Thanks to these projects, we we have produced evidence which is relevant to identify the best strategies to bridge some gaps when it comes to education and better understand vulnerable context to favor adaptation and sustainability. These projects create a collaboration ecosystem that brings together those who implement the projects, researchers, Ministry of Education, the community, and others who are committed to the use of evidence to improve education practices. This exchange between projects in countries accelerates adaptation and the scaling up of innovation in education to strengthen capabilities in education in our region to respond to these vulnerabilities. It is within this context that we are organizing this conference that has to do with teaching practices in vulnerable context. The lessons learned from KIX LAC. So we will be here for 2 days and we will organize the conversation around 3 topics. Today we will be covering 2. Transforming teaching to better respond to vulnerable context. And the second one has to do with persistent gaps that we identify in education. Tomorrow, we will talk about the adaptation of educational system in vulnerable context. And we are going to be discussing applied research projects that are part of KIX ecosystem that will be complemented by representatives of ministries of education and other institutions that are relevant in the countries where we are implementing the project. We will also have time for an exchange based on the audience questions. So we would like to ask panel members to remember to respect the time we assigned for them because this is going to be a long conference. So for the formal kickoff, we would like to invite Dante Castillo to share some words. He's Policy Innovative Practices Director. He has focused on social research. He studied in London, also in Cambridge. He was also a researcher for higher education policy. And today, he's a Policy and Innovative Practices Director at SUMMA, and he coordinates the project to empower teachers. So he has this point of view of our institution, and he will talk about the connection between research, policy, practice. So in the next few minutes, we will enjoy listening to him. Dante, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Rosa Maria. Let me just share my screen. I think you can see it now, right? If you can confirm. Yes, it's working perfectly. All right, thank you so much, Rosa Maria, and to the team for the invitation. Good morning, everybody, friends and colleagues joining us for this seminar. Because, of course, our goal is to focus on teacher-related issues. So I'd like to share some thoughts and an invitation as an introduction to talk about the value of collaboration or collective learning that allows us to connect research, evidence, and the work done in education in both practice and policy for education. So, of course, I would like to thank the team at KIX LAC for inviting me to share some words today. And I would like to connect the work we are doing at SUMMA with teacher professional development in Latin America and in the Global South. Secondly, on behalf of SUMMA, I would like to welcome the colleagues joining us for these 2 days, representatives from ministries of education, civil society organizations, research teams, international organizations, unions, and all the different stakeholders that are part of the KIX ecosystem in Latin America and the Caribbean. In particular, those organizations that were invited to this seminar. CLADE, Education 2020, Raise Your Voice, different organizations that have collaborated with us in the past. So the goal of this seminar is to highlight the richness of the different projects and applied research that are part of the KIX ecosystem. And our main goal for today has to do with three things that we believe are particularly relevant: to share findings, showcase pedagogical innovations that could be implemented in vulnerable contexts, and promote regional exchange, which of course is part of the core work that the KIX LAC Center plays in Latin America and the Caribbean. I would say those are the three main goals that shapes today's seminar and this space for conversation, as Rosa Maria also mentioned. The seminar also focus its attention on a topic that is key for improvements in education and learning outcomes that has to do with teaching practices in vulnerable contexts. When preparing this seminar, we heard that teaching in vulnerable context means that you need to transform the conditions that support teachers for initial teacher training, continuing professional development, having the support and resources that teachers need to respond or tackle the diversity of contexts they work in. And of course, based on what we've seen, we could reflect on how systems, educational systems in general, and in particular when it comes to teacher professional development, need to move to more resilient systems, given the uncertainty we see, the disruptions we see, and the risks that pose a threat for educational communities, as we all know. And I think there's another thing that's also what defines or sets our work apart in the different hubs, in our case in KIX Lab in Latin America, and that is that we need to listen to evidence, to the results of the research. And KIX is actually a space that wants to be a mechanism for that evidence, that knowledge, to be used by those who are drafting policy, implementing initiatives, and of course, teaching at the school level. They're at the front line of work in education and pedagogy. So what we see and what we value from SUMMA and through these partnerships for more than 6 years with IDRC is to move evidence and contribute to strengthen the systems. And we all know that in this case, KIX as a project from GPE actually wants to serve as a space to move or mobilize knowledge. And that means thinking about the relationships between different stakeholders, co-creation, exchange of knowledge, and different experiences. And I would also say that we also need to strengthen capabilities and capacities to
de que unos producen, por un lado, ¿sí? Los académicos, los científicos producen por un lado, y otros lo usan, pierden de vista el carácter social del conocimiento. Y me
that
parece que
forgets
el
that
paso del
knowledge has
SUMMA ha
this
tratado de
social
impulsar
element to it.
esta idea
And I
de que
think
los
this is the
consensos pueden
space
influir
to
en la
strengthen that
psiquis de estos
idea
niños.
that
No podemos pensar
knowledge is distributed across the system. We could think of a training program, for example, like the ones SUMMA implements throughout the region. One, for example, a program focused on reading and writing skills, which is key, of course. And we have their technical teams that have a better idea of the diagnosis. They have data, they know the gaps that need to be overcome. So you could think of such a scenario, right? On the other hand, you have representatives from governments, from the different ministries, that they know the rules of the system. They know when is a good time to conduct this training. They also know how to reach teachers better so they can have enough motivation to take these courses. They know the culture of teachers and how much they value training and in which areas. On the other hand, we have teachers, of course, who know their students better. They know where the main difficulties are, the situation of their families, the background of their students, and they know what topics motivate them the most. So what's the point that I'm trying to underscore here? That none of these stakeholders have the entire diagnose or entire picture of the problem or the potential solution. So through this program, we see that we can have improvements once we acknowledge that there are different capabilities, skills, and knowledge that is distributed. And of course, we need to underscore that, we need to value that, acknowledge that, and facilitate collaboration and the sharing of lessons and different experiences. That's one key idea. A second key idea that I would like to mention, and it's something we've been working on too, has to do with this idea that knowledge is shared, right? Based on that, we know that we need to favor collaboration networks. And that's the idea behind KIX LAC, to have this network that values the different sources of knowledge, the different stakeholders that are part of the educational system. So these networks connect different stakeholders, it's a place to exchange resources, and that allows us to mobilize knowledge. And that also means that we'll have better chances for this to be part of the policy and also local practices. For example, we have this project which is called Empowering Teachers. And for that, we created this network that gives them a space for exchange globally, but also in Latin America. We have different stakeholders that are part of this network. And we've seen that there's an agreement in different points of view, right? And they improve each other. The point of view of the government, academia that usually provides analysis and evidence, and civil society most of the time has the practical experience, what it means to does not fragment the different positions, but it brings them together in a common space for conversation, to have deep conversations about this topic. So we see that those who engage value this space for networking because it is a real opportunity for collective learning. The third key idea that I would like to share, based on the two previous idea, right? How knowledge is distributed between different stakeholders. Secondly, networks as a space for coordination. We should work based on the idea that we should promote peer learning, because these spaces for collaboration and the networks not only contribute to these decisions being accepted, right, because they are validated, but it also provides the environment to share this knowledge, evidence through conversation, dialogue, and this collective reflection. So the idea is for the practice to go beyond dissemination, which only goes in one direction, right? And I think this is the key for these spaces, because we can actually use evidence so it becomes more relevant for the work of the different stakeholders. These communities of practice that we have under KIX LAC are also a good example of that. You have 2 minutes, Dante. Let me just finish with 2 final ideas and I'll yield the floor. There's this final 4th idea that I would like to share to move forward with this collective learning, with the networks, these peer learning processes, right? That's what actually produces collective learning. In our project for teacher professional development conducted in Honduras under KIX, we were able to produce a framework from analysis with different stakeholders. We had, specialists in education, of ministry officers, to understand in a new way the complexities and the systemic character of the challenges of professional development. It's not just about a specific policy, it had to do with the platforms for this professional development, the support teachers get, the resources, the channels for communication and exchange. So it has to do with looking at it as a system. So these are the 4 base ideas, that acknowledging that knowledge is distributed. Secondly, the strength of network and peer learning, and the opportunity to produce this shared knowledge or collective knowledge. And I would like to finish by saying that this space that KIX LAC provides and this seminar can actually help strengthen these connections between school and community, like the CLADE team says, also shine a light on gender-related topics, and also rethink about resilience for educational systems in Latin America. So with that, I just would like to say that both the goals of KIX and this conversation is to promote exchange of knowledge, strengthen capacities to identify, use, and mobilize evidence, and being able to tackle the challenges when it comes to policies in the region. In SUMMA, we've been working for 10 years already, and we are convinced that this is a valuable space for exchange. So I hope you have a fruitful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dante. It's such an important thing to know that knowledge is distributed among the actors of the system. Now we're going to start with the transformation of pedagogical practices for excluded populations. What are the transformations in the pedagogical practices that will allow to respond in a better way to students that historically have been excluded of the learning opportunities? And after the presentation of our panelists, we will open space for questions and answers. And first, we're going to invite Nelsy Lizarazo. She is an educator, popular educator with a degree in philosophy, and also has a postgraduate course in political sciences and international affairs. She's been working in formal education, non-formal education, community education, and also in alternative communication for the defense of human rights. And also she has been an activist of nonviolence for the Presenza International Agency of News, and also she is coordinator of CLADE. She is going to talk about the main findings about the lessons learned from the project of inclusive pedagogy for the community education in the early childhood. Thank you, Nelsy, for being here with us. The floor is yours. Thank you, Rosa, and thank you to all the team from KIX LAC. We am very happy to be here. I send my greetings to all my colleagues that have been with us through this journey that has been such an interesting process of learning. where we have seen a lot of commitment during this time of the duration of these projects called KIX projects in the daily jargon that we use. So first of all, I just wanted to greet everyone, all the team that has participated in this project and in this process, the OME, Latin America and the Caribbean, the teams from the Education Collective from Guatemala, and the team from Honduras, the national members of the CLADE, which is the Latin American Campaign for the Right for Education. And Rosa, please remind me what's the time that we have destined for this presentation. You have 15 minutes now. So this presentation has a lot of things to say. I'm sorry I couldn't summarize much more, and you will keep these. I just wanted to show you the detail, and I would like to highlight what for us this has been more important in this process. Are you seeing my presentation correctly?
Se ve muy bien, perfecto. Adelante.
Yes, we are. So the project is called Inclusive Pedagogy with a focus in gender for the early child education in the communities in Guatemala and in Honduras. So I just mentioned the team that participated here from the territories, from the regions, and this project was developed in 6 rural educational centers in Guatemala and in Honduras in order to strengthen early education, community early education through the construction of a pedagogical model based on the dialogue, learning, the transformative research and participation, and also with the focus in gender and community participation. So we reached this with a validated methodology that was validated in the south of the continent. It was very interesting. It was like moving from one region to another region with different cultural, historical contexts. And we tried to find or try to see that all the methodology would be adapted to the practices, to the context, the dynamics, the territorial dynamics from Honduras and Guatemala, that as you imagine, these are different contexts from the ones from Chile, where this model was created, or even other countries such as Peru, where this has been implemented, but also they have also adapted it. So it was from the beginning this purpose of escalation from a model from one subregion of the continent to another subregion of the continent. So it was a very interesting process, participative, where we had different dialogues with the context and with the actors of the different territories. We created this systematization exercise that we want you to check in our webpage, where we collected the voices from 188 participants, and out of them 143 children, boys and girls, in order to perceive how they were feeling or how they would feel changes in their lives in the classrooms, in the relation with their teachers, of the teachers with their pedagogical practices, and in their relationships of care and participation in the educational communities. One of the most interesting things is that we worked in the gender focus, not only from the gender itself, but from the place of care and the role of care and the right of care that parents, uncles, aunts, grandmothers, grandparents have. So this has been a continuous process in the participative action research process that would allow us to feed the next step. So we would collect different learnings, collect different findings, and then taking the next steps to accompany the process. So these gave us the flexibility to have this dialogue with the territories, and the territories would feel autonomous in order to perform the adaptations or the customization that they would have to do following the main guidelines of the pedagogic model. This implementation process involved this assessment, the accompanying in these teachers training in the different schools, and also the collective reflection and permanent reflection in order to improve all the things that we were doing in the schools, with the communities, with the mixed commission spaces where we had different actors, where they were feeding or giving this information about the process, and they were involving the other actors of the community, including local authorities as well, in order to participate and being involved with what was happening or going on in the schools, and also these commitments of a possible or likely adaptation of this process to other schools or to other communities where we work. So the pedagogical axis is the dialogic learning, and the main principles of this kind of learning, you can see them here. We have the egalitarian dialogue, the cultural intelligence transformation, the instrumental dimension, and I don't see my screen very well here, but never mind. So also, among others, also the equality among the differences, the solidarity, that's the axis of this inclusion model of this inclusive pedagogy at a communitarian level. Here we have the different strategies, the interactive groups, the dialogic communities, and what the model achieves was what we could collect and systematize and obtain as an evidence is a very deep change in the relationships in the classroom. This is a deep change in the role of teachers, and also a big change in the way the children behave in the classroom, which is more free, more autonomous, with more expression capacity of communicating what they feel, what they think, what they observe, without any kind of fear to what the others could say, the adults could say. And here we see the main findings. The first one is the transformation of the way of teaching, of the relationship between teachers and students, moving from traditional practices to experiences in which children felt recognized, acknowledged as subjects able to dialogue, ask, argue, tell about their own knowledge, share that without any kind of shame, and also receive the feedback from their colleagues and from their partners and from their teachers, what they could share as well. This allowed them to strengthen their socio-emotional skills, empathy, this being together to have different roles or play different roles from the ones appointed to children and to boys and girls, to know that children could cook, could serve, the girls could play soccer, and all these things that might seem tiny things, but they are the change that we see from the beginning in the roles that have already been established. The second finding is the innovation was built with the communities. So this is fundamental in the model that we are proposing and that we have escalated in these territories, because it is related to how we open the school to the community, and the community receives the school, and the members of the community are responsible for the care and the protection of their boys and their girls, even the very young children, but it includes mainly the right to education. So this community participation has been been maintained, and this has allowed the territories to make this model their own model. And we believe that these schools are going to maintain this model, and we will see the possibility of this dialogue between others, between or among different schools. In order to widen the model that is not difficult to implement, it doesn't require a lot of techniques, but it's mainly the transformation of the way of understanding the educational bond and the educational processes, which is one of the main transformations that we need in the school, in the classrooms. Also, the third finding, this needs to involve or to transform relationships, the relationships between adults and children, the relationships of among genders, between teachers and families that are not quite fluent sometimes, are not that smooth sometimes, because we know that for teachers that the intervention and the involvement of families might create tension, and families might not be very happy with the role of the teachers. So this model favors or encourages that these type of strains of tensions disappear, transforming themselves into relationships of dialogue, bond, of this working together, of this co-responsibility with children, with boys and girls. And also the fourth finding is related that we have to say that transformations take time, because these changes that we have promoted, this includes a change in the culture, in the institutional culture of the school. So this creates, or this supposes, a revision of the teachers by themselves, of their practice, of the families, and this takes time. We are sure that we have sown powerful seeds, but we know that cultural change requires these processes, it requires this time, requires time accompanying, and the main change is this change in the responsibility, in the care and participation of men in education and the care of boys and girls. So this is a change that requires a longer time. So we also think that this project relates to all these learnings for the region. We think that the educational innovations have more possibilities of being sustained as if they are developed as located processes built from different realities in terms of culture, with different dynamics in the territories. This seems to be a very long journey, but I think it's a safer journey from what we have been learning in this process and in other processes that we have followed as CLADE. The second is that the combination between dialogic learning and the transforming participative action and research, this strengthens the community involvement, because the actors find their own alternatives and responses of solutions to the context where they live. So they build with them the solutions and alternatives, but also the understanding of what is happening to them, of what they need, of what they want to reach, of what they are looking for their communities, and especially in this case based on the boys and girls, children. And the final reflection. I just want to tell you that, and aligned with what I have shared with you, the long-lasting transformations are the ones that change the way of understanding the learning and the situation in the schools. To see the relationships in the school and in the classroom is the best condition to assure steady and long-lasting learnings from the early childhood until the end. So I think this opens real opportunities for those who have been systematically being excluded. I'm sorry, I'm going to finish soon, Rosa, don't worry. But I just wanted to add or to say that Guatemala was such an incredible challenge, because it was the challenge of working with indigenous populations with a different language, and we had this big challenge of these intercultural differences, so that was very powerful. That we learned a lot from them and it was a big learning from us for the communities and for us as a regional team. These type of conceptual adaptations and ways of understanding from your own mother tongue what is going on. It's hard to to explain all these things because these are experiences that are that occur in the moment, that are very deep and that are not easy to describe. So I just wanted to tell you this, that it's not only about the classroom, but it's being only in the classroom, it's a mistake. We have to involve the communities, the different actors, or stakeholders, and it is important to see how these processes of learning are built. It's not only the reason or what is that for, but how to do that. That is very important when we talk about learnings for life, for the life of children. So I would say that I want to invite you to see our webpage. The webpage of the project, you will see a lot of material, pedagogical materials, games materials, different work materials, and the one who wants to see this, you can experience this, but tell us about it. Please tell us about it because we need to know how you're using these and we can continue with our dialogue. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nelsy. So in the chat, we share this CLADE sheet information. Thank you so much for your presentation. I keep that information, that this finding that the deep changes of the relationships in the classroom were evident and that innovation is built with the communities.
So now we would like to hear the representative of the Ministry of Education of Guatemala, Francisco Cabrera, who's also going to share some thoughts about this KIX project. Mr. Vice Minister, thank you. The floor is yours. Thank you. It is my pleasure to join you today. I see that we have many people coming from different parts of the region. And of course, these are interesting topics, but are also provocative, right? Because many of us have been working education in our countries and our region for years now. But I think there's always something new, something that helps us improve our reflection on how to make educational systems learn, how they can learn to be more inclusive, right? So I believe that spaces for this type of reflection and analysis to share new evidence is always a fruitful experience, and it can always lead to something better. Of course, that's not always the case, right? Because I'm sure many of us here have been part of other spaces for reflection and analysis that not always help us move forward. But in spite of that, we can also learn from that. I would like to thank Nelsy for her presentation. I'm familiar with the process she was describing. Of course, it's being conducted in my country too. And based on what Nelsy shared on behalf of CLADE about this project in Guatemala and Honduras, there are a few things that I would like to highlight to put them on the table for their reflection over the next 2 days. The first one is the fact that I think that this local experience was gathered in this document that I was reviewing while Nelsy was speaking, because she shared that link with us, right, via the chat. And I think that document systematizes the experience, and it's worth having a look at that. But I also wanted to add something that has to do with how we can allow for systems and not just local projects to help us move forward. Because at the end of the day, we're not just talking about a specific community, but about an entire group, about a system, a national system that organizes to provide access to education, because that's our right, in spite of any difficulties that we see in our region and throughout the world, actually, because those issues are always challenging us. And that's why I wanted to share these ideas with you. I think one of the key challenges we face that's inviting to reflection is, what can we do when we're thinking about vulnerable populations? We're not talking about a small group here, but that a condition of vulnerability covers a large group of children that should go to school, right? So basically, what can we do in our countries when we see exclusion that is not limited to a specific group, but it's actually the main feature characteristic of the country? That has to do with historical reasons, structural reasons that we're not going to discuss now, but basically we need to cover the entire group and not just as a local level. And I think that's a challenge we face as a region, because we have documented and discussed different projects with support of international organizations too, but that not always produce a transformative process of the system as a whole. I'm not saying they're not useful, but they do not change everything. So I would say there's this step lacking that allows you to go from a focalized, a specific experience to take the leap and impact the entire system. And I think that's a critical leap we all know about, but we haven't discussed it enough, because it always translates into a limitation in the educational system. We are very good with innovating in a specific context, but we're not that good on taking that to the system itself, for the entire system to benefit from a local experience. And I think there's an opportunity there for research to gather data and to analyze what happens, so we can actually be more successful in scaling up those efforts. So to try to put some words to explain this idea, and this is something we discuss in meetings like this, and that has to do with evidence too, evidence-based decision making. But please bear in mind that sometimes evidence is written in a different language than the one used by those who make the decisions. And I'm not talking about grammar, of course. I'm saying that evidence focuses on a specific space, right? You always need to put the limits around the scope of your research, whether it's geography, a specific age group, etc. But then you cannot extrapolate that to the group, because the evidence has its limitations, of course. And I think we have work to do there. Those who are reflecting on these topics, this is something we need to do. We need to think about how we can help educational system to make a better use of the evidence we produce, and how do we make that evidence useful for the system. And that is something we need to do, but I'm not trying to be negative. I'm not saying we haven't done anything or that we are not trying. What I'm saying is that we need to adjust our efforts, work together with the different stakeholders here to make sure that when the time comes to make a decision, it can actually be informed by the evidence. Because I see evidence, that we have been focusing on having evidence, but I don't think most decisions are evidence-based when it comes to the public sector management of education. And maybe I'm focusing the discussion on that because I'm now working in the public sector, but most of my experience, most of my career, I've been working with civil society, with a cooperation institutions. But thinking about the public sector, most of that evidence that is produced is not that helpful in your daily decision making in the public sector, because as I said, they use a different language. They are thinking about different situations or conditions that are not so easy to adapt or scale up to the entire system. But basically, that's my reflection, because I think it can help guide the discussion and the analysis of this seminar. And now I'd like to take the opportunity to try to go beyond what we have done so far when we have these chances for conversation and reflection. But on the few minutes I have left, I would like to mention a couple of elements that are key, I think, in our experience. Nelsy talked about how we have systematized the experience in Guatemala and Honduras. I think that document is valuable. I will invite you all to have a look at that. As a Ministry of Education, we are trying to do something that maybe it's not new for the region, but at the institutional level, it's new. Having these systematization efforts for institutional learning. So this means we're not just writing these documents for those who might be interested in different parts of the world and in the academia, but the idea is for this systematization to produce an actual learning for the institution or the organization itself, which means that we should see a change in the guidelines or how we work. And as I said, this is not new, but it's the leap we need to take, because that would also be quite positive. And I just would like to comment on two experiences from the past 2 years in Guatemala in our education system. I would like to invite you to learn more about it, because I think when it comes to applying evidence and lessons learned for decision making based on the existing evidence could be quite valuable. For a little over 2 years, we've been working on a strategy for learning that is focusing on learning skills that children lost during COVID. And I think there's a valuable experience there on how to have these projects in different primary schools in the region, focusing on improving reading and also understanding, right? I think that's a nice example of this intervention you can implement at the general level to improve literacy and reading skills in children. And this is an inclusion strategy, actually, because we see the impact that shutting down schools had during COVID. Of course, that's not new, right? And there is another experience that I think is quite interesting that has to do with a program that takes schools to museums, which is a program that allows schools throughout the country to access to funding and support for students to visit any museum in the country. And we have many that are not that visited or not popular. So this is another effort when it comes to inclusion, because even if you're talking about a rural school, they have the possibility to visit a museum in another part of the country and learn from this. So we are talking about multicultural experiences here, because it's not just a museum, right? The travel itself, the context, there are many lessons learned, and also the work you can do after the visit. And as it was said earlier today, this is an effort that focuses on how to have more impact of our learning processes based on evidence for decision making. This is something we're working on in our country, and I would like to stop here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share these thoughts. I hope that it could be useful for the debate of the next 2 days. Once again, I would like to thank the organizers. I would like to also thank them for their support throughout the years. So the best. I would like to send you all my best. Thank you so much, Mr. Vice Minister. And now I would like to reflect on something you were saying, that exclusion in some countries is the norm, and that's our main challenge. Now we're going to start with our second part, with the second set of projects. We would like to listen to Ericka Alvarado, an education specialist from the University of El Salvador. She has studies in the Basque country. She has been managing different projects for education and gender for different institutions, and today she is the education specialist for the EDUCO Foundation in El Salvador. Ericka will share the main findings and lessons learned for the project Scaling Learning Through Play Model for Early Childhood Education. Please, Ericka, the floor is yours.
Hola, hola ahora. ¿Logran ver mi pantalla?
Now you can see my screen, right?
La presentación.
You don't see my presentation, right?
Ok,
No, we don't see it yet.
vamos a ver. Entonces, perdón. Me dice que deje de compartir. ¿Ahora?
Ahora sí.
Miran la PPT.
Vemos la PPT, pero ponlo en presentación. Ahora está perfecto.
There you are. It's okay now.
Bien. Bueno,
Okay, thank you so much. Now I will start. Good morning, everyone. I represent EDUCO and the Pedagogic University, which has been our partner in our KIX project that was implemented in 2024-2026 at a national level in El Salvador. So our project is escalating a learning model through play for the early education in El Salvador. So I just wanted to tell you about how this started. What was it about? So this project, El Salvador Learns by Games or by Playing. Its aim is to look for the contribution to the a complete management of the management of the early childhood education based on the evidence studying that EDUCO has its model growing and learning together. It has its own model that is in the community implementation in 3 different territories of the country at a national level, where we have the different modalities for the early childhood education. So it was mainly focused in locating or using the play pedagogy as a key tool for the childhood development and school transition. So part of the objectives of this implementation, I would like to see the specific points. One is the search of this creation of knowledge and evidence and the contribution to the impact of the early childhood through the implementation of the model. So we can see that the model of EDUCO, and this we also research based on this model. So we can see how this model can create this evidence, can mobilize the knowledge, and can set this in the different different educational agenda with the different actors for this decision making for the educational policies. The second was to strengthen the capacities and skills of teachers and key actors that incorporate this play pedagogy. Here we train different teachers with this right to play, different methodologies and different strategies to improve these teachers' practice. And the third one was to generate these strategies of the mobilization of knowledge and also have an impact in the scalability with the different actors. So this was implemented by EDUCO and the Pedagogic University in El Salvador. This is specialized, is the only university that has this master's degree specialized in early childhood. And with the strengthening of our partners, we created all these actions and we reached these achievements that I'm going to share with the cooperation of GPE, IDRC, that were supporting us, also KIX, in all this process that we developed. So as part of the results that we have as country that we want to share with you, we see the generation of evidence of our model, positioning with this evidence the right to play, because in El Salvador, through this educational local group, through this priority of the country that the government of El Salvador has established, they have established to prioritize the early childhood, and from there is this construction of the national regulation frameworks, such as the Act, Crecer Juntos, or Growing Together, that establishes the early childhood as a very important stage. And also in the article number 60, they established the priority of play or games, and also in number 61 to enable safe spaces, ideal spaces that are equipped for the learning of girls. So with all these tools at a country level and all this prioritization, we add or we sum all these efforts to intervene in the generation of knowledge. So EDUCO performs 3 researches, and the first one is the one that I'm just sharing, how to create this knowledge that was about the factors that hinder the development of pedagogy of play, and proposes of different strategies to change these situations in the work that is being developed by EDUCO in their model of Círculo de Familia, family circle through the community. So this research showed some findings. We have the documents that we can also share, those links that you will see in the web pages of GPE, KIX, and EDUCO. You can see them, and among these findings, we can see that the main point is that the gaps for the family participation and the persistence of the gender stereotypes, we see that there is 68% that acknowledge that are the mothers, the ones who mainly play with their children, and 62.3% consider that the responsibility of the game or is from the mothers. Also, we saw that the family participation in games is quite high, but the stereotypes, the gender stereotypes, continue to limit the co-responsibility of the play or the games. And also in this study, we see some factors that are related to the context and also to the community dynamic. We see that 39% of mothers and fathers consider that children play outside home and the girls should play inside the house, so or in very safe spaces. So we see that the reduction of the community games outside or out of the house, and the relationship with the use of screens and the lack of these games that assure the games or the plays as part of this early childhood. And also we see some limitations in terms of resources, and we see that 74% of those that were surveyed, mothers or parents as a whole, they have stated that their children have good spaces for playing, but we see deficiencies in the access to didactic material that needs this proposition or using technological materials to create or to implement these strategies. Also, another study that we performed in the project for the generation of evidence was the diagnosis about the inclusion of the early childhood in the training offer of the different institutions, such as universities. And here we have a consultation at a national level where we had all the universities of the country that offered any kind of studies in early education. So as a result, we saw that playing is a priority for universities. Here we see that 91.3% of the universities acknowledge that playing is a priority access in the training of the future professionals. Another result is that there is a commitment, but still we have challenges or we face challenges in this area. 93.1% of universities acknowledge playing as a priority access in the teacher's training. And also the third study from the project, we see a diagnosis about the impact of reach through the learning and playing spaces generated by the model of EDUCO, that is the family circle, that is the model growing and learning together in the community. And we see that this study, here they perform an analysis about their strategies, their methodologies, what can be scalable in this model. So part of the main findings, the first result is that playing strengthens the childhood development or the children's development. This has a value or an assessment of 4.7 out of 5 that shows the improvement of development in children, especially in their different skills, cognitive skills, motor skills, language, and expression of emotions. The second result, they highlighted that these learning spaces, they locate the playing as a learning tool for the educational transition. They highlight that enabling safe, inclusive, and encouraging spaces will favor learning through the playing, and it also strengthens the development of the early childhood. And also here in this result, in part of the project we launched for the mobilization of knowledge, this space of repository for the first childhood. This is a digital repository with the support of the Pedagogic University with their domain, articulated with EDUCO, the socialization of results. In this repository, you will find all the research, but also you will find all the documentation that is being collected in the country about the early childhood. It reached in its launch 535 people that participated here, and we have had 915 views. Here we have the director and the vice dean of the university. Here, as a result of the knowledge in alliance with the Ministry of Education and the Office of the First Lady, they strengthened the sensibilization about the importance of playing in the early childhood with different radio information or radio commercials, where we reach 6,165 people. I'm going to share this with you just in case you want to listen to that, but now I'm going to skip that. But now we have this, in this generation of evidence, we have the proposal of the strategy of escalation for an educational initiative that is called Sense Garden or Jardín Sensorial, where we see that the impact of the models shows what can be scalable from the EDUCO model and expand this at a national level in all areas, public public-private organizations in order to disseminate this experience. So here we have the official document. I'm going to share a summary, the strategy of this scaling in order to widen its scope. They want to widen the scope of the initiative that is called Jardín Sensorial. First, they want to strengthen the learning and process through playing and through the 5 senses, the learning for boys and girls and teachers. So from these results, we see that this type of scaling in the study, it states that it should be done horizontally. Here we have had the support of Rosie's team that is part of GPE that have supported us in this process. And this type of escalation talks about widening the coverage of the educational initiative and bringing this to different geographical zones or to more communities or to more areas. So here we see the graph of this horizontal escalation that is in 2 ways: at a level of expansion that wants to reach more people, and also at a level of the instance that creating this initiative. And also this states a methodology of an open code. This is available. These guidelines of Jardines Sensoriales is available and is part of the national strategy for playing and how to establish, how to set this census garden. And also this document shows and offers to all the institutions at a national and a regional level the possibility to expand this or to apply this. We see here the opportunities for the expansion that EDUCO has, and we see here a great opportunity with CLADE, with other actors that are allies at a national level, and also in the result at a national level. So as part of the conclusions to share with you about the scalability, so how do we think this is an opportunity to offer this to the country and to the educational agenda so this can be scaled? This has a regulation framework and of public policies that are favorable to the early childhood. We see here all the acts and legal documents that allow this document to be considered. And also we see this guide of sensor or census gardens with the support of Crecer Juntos Institute. They are developing this with the universities. EDUCO proposes this kind of escalation at a horizontal way to have a higher coverage, a better, and use the installed capacity. This is not a closed strategy, but it's an opportunity to use the pedagogy of playing. We have some recommendations as well in the project that we see, or we have 3 main actors: the academy, where we want to continue mobilizing the knowledge that has been produced in the project, and also to widen the academic offer about early childhood to create this evidence about the play as an important axis, and also to have different strategic alliances with the ministry, with Crecer Juntos, and also for the government to create this generation of evidence for the decision-making in the programs and policies, and also to use the experiences of organizations to implement actions in order to comply with the policies. Part of the lessons learned, to close my presentation, so we have seen that we have talked about the implementation of the project, the contextualized evidence that favors the sustainability of innovations and its incorporation in public policies. It is also important to highlight the interinstitutional relationships, the networks, the SALDE, CLADE, from different allies that have supported us in the project that strengthen the learnings, all these networks with the continuity of actions, and also in the relation with the universities and the academy in order to provide scientific support and strengthen the generation and mobilization of knowledge, the early participation of different actors, the strengthening of different capacities, and the mobilization of knowledge are fundamental for this sustainable scaling. and through time, and also the institutional commitment in the long term that also support the sustainability of these projects, the articulation between research, training, and communication that will strengthen the uptake and scaling of these type of strategies, and then the methodologies and strategies application that place the methodology or the pedagogy of playing for in the center of the processes of learning and teaching for the strengthening of the teachers' practices related to the context in the different countries. I want to close that saying that telling you that education heals, empowers, and protects. I want to thank all our allies from these 2 years of the implementation of the project. I want to thank GP KIX, SUMMA, ITRC, all the team that were related and supporting us with the Office of the First Lady, the Instituto Crecer Juntos, the Ministry of Education, our partners from the Universidad Pedagógica, the local group of education where we presented the project, also the Resalte that was also supporting us in, and also we had these students that came to participate here, and the universities of the country that also have helped us, to the EDUCO team in all the areas that are regional and national level, and especially to the ambassador of Canada. I want to share with you this photo where she was here with us in these 2 years in these projects. She was involved in this. She was very, very committed with this. And this is a photo where we had our public event in the closure of this project, where we presented the achievements, the findings, and also we have Rosa Maria from KIX that was here in our country. So to Florencio as well, to all the team from ITRC, thank you so much. And I am looking to hear from your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Ericka, for that presentation. It is so relevant how you contribute to children's development and that El Salvador is supporting the scaling up of these sensory ideas. So next time we should have a coffee talking about these sensory gardens. Now I'd like to invite Cristina Lima from the Office of the First Lady of El Salvador to share some thoughts and comments about this project from the KIX ecosystem. Cristina, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours. Hi, good morning. I'm part of the education team at the Office of the First Lady. I have been working closely with the curriculum department that was in charge of designing the new curriculum for early childhood education. So I would like to tell you a little more about how the strategy of the sensory gardens, the jardines sensoriales, the research, and the support they provide that goes in line with our new curriculum for early childhood education. But briefly, of course, the model covers many topics, but briefly, I would like to give you an idea of how we are completely aligned with research and how the decisions that have been made and the ones that we will make in the future will also consider the work that's being done. First, I would like to talk about this curriculum for early childhood education. The pedagogical model is based on 4 pillars. These 4 pillars include active learning, and I'm telling you a little about this so you can have a better idea on how these 4 pillars are completely aligned with the work of the sensory gardens and their contribution to our children. So all pillars converse and go hand by hand with these pillars. So first, active learning. Our pillar in active learning says that children learn by doing, by exploring, by researching, and basically we would like to provide them with autonomy so they can solve problems from their daily lives. So They do this through learning by doing. The second pillar has to do with the quality of interactions. And when we talk about interactions, we are talking about parents, children, that they have a warm, respectful relationship that also provide a stimulus for the children to continue learning. And this also goes in line with the sensory gardens. The third pillar is participation. And basically, what that means for us is that children have the opportunity to make decisions when it comes to the type of projects they want, decisions that have to do with what we study, that they can share their ideas for that to be comprehensive. And the idea is for all of them to be involved, because this framework thinks that inclusion in education is quite relevant. So the idea is for these experiences to be comprehensive, that they all can get engaged, to have warm, respectful relationships, to have this comprehensive learning experience. And the fourth pillar has to do with play. And as Ericka said, for El Salvador and for our framework, it is a right, first of all, because it is a natural activity and a key learning experience for children in their early years. So it is a right and it's a natural way in which children learn. So that's why we are highlighting play, because we have come to realize that children do learn by playing. They need to play in order to learn, in order to grow and develop according to their chronological age and the expectations of adults and everybody else. Play also helps them think, helps them with problem solving, allows them to better communicate, to express thoughts, but also to acknowledge how they are expressing their own emotions, because through play, they can share their emotions, their feelings, something that probably they wouldn't be able to do if they're sitting down listening to the teacher. Play also allows you to share with one another. It doesn't matter if there's a specific a condition or issue or disability. Playing is for everybody. They all can learn by playing with others. They can use their imagination, create, and explore. That's the key word. They explore the world. If we go back to the sensory gardens, you could imagine, of course, all the things they can do when it comes to exploration, when interacting with this garden. And they also build their identity through their own personality, through what their aspirations and who they are. They can develop this through play, and that is also important for us because we believe that these meaningful experiences for young children in the early education, they have these experiences inside the classroom, but also outside of the classroom. So that's why we also give children enough time to develop, to learn during recess or in their experience in the sensory gardens. During that time they have outside of the classroom. Because of course, when it's hot, we tell teachers, you are free to go outside, and children love that. They love to run around, to be outside and play with their classmates. And I don't want to repeat what Ericka said because she explained it very well, but basically every opportunity to play is an opportunity for children to discover, to learn, and for their comprehensive development. Now, as part of our model, our pedagogy, we also talk about environments, because this innovation in early childhood education considers that the environment in the classroom will change. It's not just your desk anymore or getting in line. They can sit in groups so they can interact with their classmates. But we are also focusing on learning areas, in development and learning areas, so children can work, as a class or in small groups. They can explore these areas and interact with different materials. So that's why we're also putting our efforts in having enough equipment and didactic materials. Of course, they do have their tablets and other tools, but we want them to be able to touch and explore material objects. And hopefully outside of the classroom, especially when we are talking about classrooms that have many students at once. Now, this sensory gardens strategy, aside from Ericka already mentioned, what are the benefits of it? You have 1 minute left, just to let you know. Yes, of course. We are also focusing on this holistic development, and so these sensory gardens and the research on them has also helped us relate to the teachers that this garden, the sensory gardening and playing, also offers an opportunity for children to strengthen their language skills, their motor skills, their engagement, and also educational inclusion, of course. And one other thing that I would like to mention, and Ericka also talked about this, is that through the research that's being conducted, we are also redesigning our plan for early childhood education. There are many components to it, of course, and one of those components is play. So that's all I wanted to say. Of course, there's a lot more I could tell you about, but I just wanted to focus on the work we're doing in El Salvador and how these sensory gardens are part of the strategies we're developing. Thank you very much.
Rosa María, tu audio, por favor.
Rosa María, I think you're muted. Thank you so much. My apologies. Thank you so much for your valuable comments and your participation in the designing of the curriculum. I would like to focus on what you said, that playing is a right and that it's been demonstrated that children learn through play. Now we're going to have time for Q&A. We have one question for each of our speakers for the two projects we've heard about. So the question for Nelsy, what would you say was the main contribution of the project in transforming teaching practices? Thinking about the project, what would you say about that? And if you would like to add some other thoughts, Nelsy, please, the floor is yours. Right. So of course, I'm learning here too while listening to the speakers, our colleagues that are talking about their proposals. I think it's been, wow, like this getting covered in new experiments and knowledge. This idea of a laboratory, I think it's quite inspiring. So thinking about the process we are implementing, I would insist in the idea, and I think the team agrees with me, that there's this transformative key, which is changing that relationship between adults and children in the classroom. I think that sensory play, this experience from El Salvador, also considers that. That's an additional benefit because adults, educators come from a different place in their relationship with children. So they yield the protagonism to children, so they have that possibility to express themselves and work on their capabilities, their reading skills, how they communicate orally, how they relate to others, with a guidance, of course, but no control, right? So actually allowing children to be who they are and just guiding the process. And for that, teachers need to go through this deep change in the way in which they are used to relate with children. And that's quite difficult because it's always difficult for adults to relate with children, acknowledging that they are also subjects of rights, right? Just like us, of course, that at a different point in their development. And I think that's what makes the model easier to apply, is that
Muchas gracias, Nelsy.
transformation in this
Y
relationship.
también,
Thank you so
como
much,
ilustradores,
Nelsy. And
tenemos
briefly,
una pregunta
we have another
de
question.
Frontera, Honduras,
I think it was
que se
from
encontraron algunas diferencias
Honduras. Did you
entre Honduras y
find any
Guatemala en el ritmo de
differences between
transformaciones,
Honduras and
especialmente en materia de
Guatemala
género?
in how quickly
Si los
you
resultados
saw
fueron
this
similares en ambos
transformation, especially
países.
when it
Muy
comes to
brevemente.
gender, or were the results similar for
No,
both
yo sí creo que hay
countries?
diferencias.
Yes, I do believe there are
Y
differences.
en los
Yes.
dos lugares
So
el
in both
abordaje
countries,
es difícil.
these were
El abordaje es difícil porque es un
difficult
abordaje
topics to
directamente
tackle
sobre género. Eso sí que ya lo aprendimos
when
en
you try
procesos
to cover
anteriores.
gender directly. And
Porque
that's a
tú
lesson
llegas a los
learned from previous
territorios y pones
projects. Because if
género
you go to the
en
territory
medio y hay más de
and
uno
put
que se
gender
espanta.
in the middle, at the center,
Porque, bueno,
some people would
vamos
get
ya.
scared for many different reasons.
Entonces, creo que en los dos
So
lugares, la
I
entrada por el lugar del cuidado fue un
think
acierto.
that tackling
Pero
this or addressing
logramos
this from the point of view of
un
care
poco más de
was right,
apertura
because we were
y
able
de
to have some
participación
more
de los
openness or
papás, los
willingness
tíos, los
to have the
abuelos y demás.
participation or engagement of families,
En Honduras y en
parents,
Guatemala.
grandparents,
En
etc.
Guatemala
That
nos
was
tomó un poco más de
higher in
tiempo,
Honduras than in
más
Guatemala. In Guatemala,
cuidado
it
con
took
las
longer.
sensibilidades,
We needed to
¿sabes?
be
Porque
more
también
careful with
imagina,
different
viene de atrás un
sensibilities,
modo de cuidar
because you
que
need
es
to
de los
consider
propios
that there
pueblos
is a
originarios,
way
que
of
no está
caring
bien ni mal,
that comes
sino que
from
hay que
indigenous
poner en
peoples that
diálogo
is not right
con
or
esta
wrong,
idea del
but you
cuidado.
need
Entonces
that
te
to
requiere
converse
como
with this idea of care. So for
¿qué? Pues de
that,
una sensibilidad
you need
un
to
poquito más
be
afinadas, más refinadas,
particularly
digamos.
in tune,
Entonces sí, yo sí creo
or consider these
que hay una
nuances.
diferencia, hubo una diferencia.
So I think, yes, we saw these
Perfecto,
differences
muchísimas
between the
gracias.
two
Y tengo
countries.
una pregunta
All right,
para
thank you
Ericka.
so much.
Dice, ¿qué
I have a
condiciones fueron
question for
clave para
Ericka.
incorporar el
What
juego
would you say
en
were
la
the key
política
conditions
educativa de
to
El Salvador?
include playing as
Brevemente,
part of
Ericka.
the educational policy in El Salvador?
Gracias por la pregunta
Ericka,
también. Bueno, las
thank you
condiciones,
so
como
much
las
for that
comentaba en la
question.
PPT,
So as
¿verdad?
I said
Las
during my
generaron
presentation,
desde las
the
alianzas
conditions
estratégicas
came from
con
those
el
strategic
gobierno, con
partnerships
todas las
with
instancias,
the
CLADE, el
government,
Grupo Local de
with all the
Educación
key
o CLADE,
stakeholders.
donde es
The
esta
local
plataforma
education group
diseñada
was
por la
key,
GBE, donde se prioriza la
with
agenda
this
educativa del país,
platform developed
el
by
que El Salvador
GBE,
cuente con esta
where you
priorización y
prioritize
como
the
apuesta
educational
priorizada a la
agenda.
primera infancia
So
de todos los
to
esfuerzos
have that as a
de todas
priority
las
for El
instancias,
Salvador, early
academia,
childhood
organizaciones,
education meant
gobierno,
that from all
están volcados,
stakeholders, the
¿verdad?, a
academia, different
invertir
organizations, and
en
the
el derecho
government
a la
were
educación de la primera
focused on
infancia
investing in
en
early
esta
childhood
etapa crítica o
education
crucial,
during this
importante, donde
critical
sabemos que la neurociencia
stage,
nos dice
which is
el
key because
80%
in
de las
neuroscience
capacidades son
says that
desarrolladas en esta
80% of
etapa y
capabilities
para
or
tener
skills
buenos
are
ciudadanos y
developed
ciudadanas,
during
pues es
this
importante invertir,
phase.
¿verdad?, en el
So
país.
to have
Entonces,
good
contar con los
citizens, you
marcos
need to invest
legales
in
que
early
ya
childhood
implementábamos y
education.
también
So
Cristina
having the
mencionaba,
legal frameworks,
la ley,
Cristina and I
¿verdad?,
mentioned
la priorización,
the law
las
that was
estrategias nacionales
enacted, the priorities that play national strategy, the policy for early childhood, having the platform to, disseminate or talk about the progress. So having different platforms that were focusing on applied research like GPE Kids with the teams of experts that supported the entire process, that provided us with advisory for that research to be able to include play as a right in early childhood education, because it also helps develop different skills in children. That also allows us to produce the research that we put there for the country to use it. So it's useful for decision making. As Cristina was saying, we are redesigning different programs, and we see that playing is a priority in educational practices. So the evidence that was produced by the project was a contribution there, and based on this new evidence, that document on garden scalability is another condition that allows for all of these efforts we have done in the past 2 years to be expanded and scaled up. So different conditions that meant that the entire country was working on this, and is part of those partnerships I mentioned. We have only 2 minutes for the last question before our next speaker. For any of you, could you tell us a little more about the strategies or activities that have to do with engagement or participation of community stakeholders?
¿Cuáles son esas actividades o estrategias?
What are these strategies or activities? I think these questions comes from Peru. Oh, right, I think it's Jose Luis Vargas. Yes, from Peru. Hi, Jose Luis. So, we're almost family here, right? So go ahead, Nelsy. Right. So this model of community inclusive education, one of the components or elements is what we call this mixed committee. It was called the managing committee in Guatemala because that's the decision they made. But basically, we are talking about this working table for conversations between different stakeholders. So since the start of the project, we had this joint committee when we were going through the first the early diagnose, the early research, and that committee or working table included all the different stakeholders you have in a territory, local authorities, leaders from different organizations, social or grassroots organizations in the territory, teachers, of course, etc. So literally, we have multiple actors there, but from the community. And with them, we continued working on the diagnose. We were interpreting those results with the schools to determine the strategies, how the process is going to be implemented, how we're going to get feedback. So we could say that it was almost unavoidable for those actors or stakeholders to commit increasingly from their different point of view with the process that you are implementing, because they are part of the process, they were part of the building of the process. No one came and said, this is what we're going to do, and you can just look. No, that was not the case. It was working together, deciding what we are going to do and how. So I think that acknowledgement of the potential, the contribution that everybody in the community can bring to better care for children and teach children is key. Thank you so much, Nelsy, and Ericka too. To all our panel members for this first part, thank you for the exchange with our audience. Before we continue with the second part of the day, we will hear another reflection to contribute to the topics of what we're discussing today that has to do with the use of evidence, those foundational learnings. And for that, we will listen to Brad Olsen. He has a master's in education from Harvard, and he's now a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. His work has focused on teacher professional development, education at the global level, reforms in schools, and qualitative research. Now he's senior fellow at the Brookings institution. He's going to be talking to us about evidence and reflection on scaling up educational innovation in high vulnerability context. Thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Gosh, I've been able to listen to so much really important things over the last hour and a half, and it's going to be difficult to offer some reflections that connect them all, but I'll do my best. As Rosa Maria said, my name is Brad Olsen, and among other things, I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I lead the Millions Learning Project. And part of the Millions Learning Project is to direct the ROSI group. And I think many of you all know what ROSI is. It's connected to the KIX initiative. ROSI stands for Research on Scaling the Impact of Innovations in Education. And so we work alongside of all of the KIX applied projects in order to better understand them, in order to connect them to each other, and to really get underneath what it means to successfully scale impact of innovations in education. You might ask yourself, why is it important to focus on scaling? And the answer, and I think this is something that Francisco Cabrera mentioned, is that small, local, promising, or proven projects are not enough. The depth and the breadth of the learning crisis in countries is so deep and so expansive that if we have a great innovation, it's not enough simply to pilot it and implement it in one location. It becomes incredibly important that we scale it across locations, that we don't think about projects, but we think about systems change. And in order to do that, the goal is not simply to have a wonderful program or a wonderful innovation. That's not enough. It also requires a thoughtful approach to scaling impact, scaling the results of the innovation so that it improves lives for children, for families, for communities, and ultimately changes the whole system. But even having a wonderful innovation and a great scaling strategy is still insufficient. What's also required is that the broader environment is engaged in the work. And I think that's something that we've heard a lot about today. It requires finding champions, building flexible but durable coalitions, working with government, making sure that communities are engaged as authentic partners in the scaling process, not simply passive recipients. And it's been so gratifying to hear about this great work today. What I want to do is maybe just pick up one point from each of the speakers and talk a little bit about that. I'll begin with a point that Dante made, which is the importance of networks and learning communities. He talked about collaboration and distributed knowledge. And I think that's a thing that we've been trying to do with KIX. And particularly in ROSI, we have created a global learning community. Many of you here are part of that community. And we understand that the best learning is peer exchange, learning from each other, talking about the challenges of the work, making sure that we are able to understand both the differences in each context, but some of the similarities across best practices. There's also a kind of moral or emotional power to learning communities. This is difficult work. It takes a long time. Sometimes it can be alienating work. And so the opportunity to actually come together within countries, across countries, within regions, and across the globe to share what we're learning, to ask questions of each other, to distribute the knowledge and experience is an amazing thing. And I'm glad that Rosie is doing it. I'm glad that KIX is doing it. And I'm glad that we're prioritizing it here. Something that Nelsy mentioned that I want to pick up on is the importance of centralizing teachers. It seems to me that if any education reform doesn't get to the classroom, it has not succeeded. The work of education improvement ultimately comes down to teachers and learners inside and outside schools operating differently and better so that learning is improved, so that teaching is improved, so that schools and non-formal learning sites are improved. And so ultimately the education system is improved. And I believe that the heart of that is teachers. And I don't only mean classroom teachers, I mean multiple kinds of instructors, and how important it is to understand that they are active, complex professionals. They are not passive receptacles of the work. They should be treated as partners in the work. It's important that the work of any innovation actually encourages them and supports them to work differently with learners. And I think there are multiple ways that that can be done. We've talked about some of that today, but I think it becomes really important to engage teachers early in the process, use their feedback, use their knowledge to design and develop the program, to contextualize the program. You know, Nelsy talked about the importance of systematizing the voices and the experiences of children and teachers and communities so that a program is responsive to the context in which it's meant to serve. And as a program or an innovation moves from context to context, that has to happen new each time, because something that might be true in one place isn't necessarily true in the other place. And so it's not only about getting information from the context to use in the development, design, and scaling of the innovation, but it also creates respect and trust, and it brings the practitioners, the beneficiaries of the innovation, into the equation as reciprocal scaling partners. And that becomes incredibly important. We all talk about it. I don't see it often enough. I'd like to see more of that. Francisco very thoughtfully raised the concept that it's systems, not local projects. And I think that's really important. And I mentioned something about that. But he also talked about the need for evidence. And so I want to talk just a minute about the importance of evidence. Absolutely. We need evidence. We need research. We need data, both to prove and gain support for our innovations, and also as education decision makers so that we can make the right decisions and we can adapt our projects along the way as they are scaled. But I think what's important is to broaden how we define evidence or how we define data. I think that the education architecture around the world has for many decades over prioritized quantitative information, RCTs, econometrics. And I think it's really important at this point in history to maybe tip the balance a little bit so that we're also including local knowledge, the experience of local actors. This is various kinds of qualitative data, stories, site visits. There are multiple ways to engage information to better understand and to better demonstrate the work that we're doing. And I hope that we can include local practitioners and local actors and their experiences in how we're describing and defining evidence and research and data. And as well, not only extract information from them for our own use, but make sure that we are reciprocal ethical partners with them so that the data that are being collected are useful to them too. Local decision makers and mid-level officials should be part of the decision-making process. They should be supported to use the very data they're helping to collect and compile rather than just passing it along to global folks or to central level decision makers. How can we bring the local and the middle level educationalists into the evidence equation? And I think there are multiple ways to do that, but it starts with understanding that it's a priority. Ericka mentioned several things that I think were important. The one that I'd like to point to is what she and her program are getting at, and this was supported by what Cristina Lima from the Office of the First Lady in El Salvador said, is the importance of early childhood education and play-based learning. And I think what's alongside the comments that Ericka and Cristina shared is it's important to think about how sometimes an educational innovation can change a whole culture. We often talk about demand-driven education reform, but sometimes the reform or the program or the innovation is not demand-driven per se. It's designed to disrupt long-held existing stereotypes around gender, around what play means, around how families and schools and families and other educational sites can connect with each other. And it's incredibly important and valuable, I believe, for us to understand that some of the education efforts we're engaged in are meant to change a culture. And that works a little bit differently than places where the culture already wants the kind of innovation that we might be introducing. When you are engaging in innovation that pushes against entrenched stereotypes or gender norms or views of what play is and is not, or how early childhood education is or is not considered valuable, I think it's important to go slowly but firmly, to understand the nature of the cultural resistance. We don't want to blame the individuals who are resisting it. We want to understand that there are historical and cultural forces underneath that people have absorbed as true for multiple generations, and we have to honor and yet not necessarily respect them. But we have to understand those traditions and slowly offer better ways to think about things like early childhood education, the role of families, gender and learning. I think it's important when we're doing this kind of cultural work to find champions, people who are already on board with this, and create networks of these champions, and also to, whenever possible, align the work with existing policy priorities so that we're actually working in the same direction as government wants to work. These are some of the ways in which, as Ericka and Cristina pointed out, we can actually use education innovations to change whole cultures. So that was a lot to share. I think it's so important and so interesting that we're doing all of this work. I think what's really important and what I'm seeing here is we can't be doing all of this alone and separately. It becomes incredibly important to connect the work, to connect the successes, to talk openly and honestly about the challenges, to admit when mistakes are being made so that we can learn from our mistakes. Making sure that we have diverse networks so we're not only talking to the people who already agree with us, but that we're bringing more and more people into these conversations. We should be asking ourselves who gets to be in the room when the decisions are made, making sure that we are including local actors, that we are including historically marginalized populations, whether that means women and girls or children or folks from rural locations. It becomes incredibly important to attach the kind of external experience that people bring if they're coming from outside of a country with the kind of local power and the kind of local knowledge that already exists in communities. And if that connection between the two sides, I've talked about this as Velcro, if that Velcro between the two sides is respectful, is mutually reciprocal, and is talked about openly and honestly, then there's no end to what we all can do together to improve the world and to improve Latin America and the Caribbean so that our education systems are better in ways that will allow the next generation of young people to succeed and to thrive and to fill in the gaps that we unfortunately have left for them. Thank you so much for this work. I want to thank SUMMA for inviting me to share a couple of comments, and I look forward to the next opportunity for us all to get together and have a conversation. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Brad, por tu presentación y por resaltar el
Thank you so
importante
much,
papel
Brad, for
de
the
estos
presentation
proyectos
and for highlighting these projects and see them in a cross-sectional way, such as what Rosy has done.
Las innovaciones son excelentes.
And although when innovations are excellent, scaling them requires the commitment of everyone. Thank you so much, Brad, for your contribution. Now we are going to go to the second block to strengthen the teachers' capabilities to bridge those gaps. So what are the professional development and teacher support strategies help promote more inclusive and equitable learning environments? So just like in the previous block, we will have the presentation of different panelists, we will see the comments, and also we will finalize with a Q&A session. Now we are going to invite Angel Caglin and Carrie Wright. Angel has a lot of experience in terms of equity, leadership, teachers' leadership, and innovation sensitive to context. She has coordinated the project of social innovation in St. Lucia and Haiti. She's currently the leader of the project of this leadership lab that is being focused in rethinking education through inclusion, innovation, and systemic change. And also with us is Carrie, who has experience in the research of innovation in the different public organizations and in the design and evaluation of structures that would allow to encourage innovation and cooperation with governments and non-profit organizations. She is an associate research in Belgium, School of Education in Waterloo, Canada, and also she works for the Innovation and Leadership Lab. Angel and Carrie will talk about the main findings and the lessons learned from the project, gender equity and inclusion in the Caribbean schools. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you so very much for the opportunity to share the work that we have been doing with our project. Thank you very much to SUMMA, to GPE, to KIX, and to IDRC for this opportunity as well. So the project that we're working on is being implemented in the Commonwealth of Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. And it's being implemented with Raise Your Voice St. Lucia and the Caribbean Innovation and Leadership Lab. Now, today's session asks an important question: what professional development and teacher support strategies help promote more inclusive and equitable learning environments? And our response comes from the Full Potential program. We're learning that inclusive education is more than just access to school. It's about the students' everyday experiences of school. Do they feel safe? Do they feel respected, heard? Do they feel like adults believe in them? And do they experience fairness, care, and belonging? The Full Potential program is using a whole school approach. And what that means is that teachers, principals, and ministry leaders are all part of the change process. Teachers are not simply receiving training. They're invited to reflect, to use evidence, to test practical solutions in their own classrooms and schools. The principals help to support the school culture and connect that work to school improvement. And ministry leaders help to interpret the evidence and then consider what can be supported and scaled across the system. So the model that the Full Potential program uses brings together 5 connected elements. First, we collect evidence or data from students and educators. Second, we create spaces for professional dialogues where educators can make sense of what the data means, bring in their professional experience and expertise. Third, we support teacher-led innovation. Again, where teachers can test those small practical responses to the issues that they observe in their classrooms and schools. Fourth, we have principal leadership, because we know that inclusive practices will become stronger when it's part of the culture of the school. And fifth, we're working with ministries on system learning using a systems thinking approach and scaling so that promising practices can inform the wider decisions happening across the system. So this model is not just about training, it's about connecting the evidence, reflection, teacher action, school leadership, and ministry learning. Now, in this presentation, we want to be able to share all of the data that we have from the Full Potential Program, but instead we will use some selected findings to show how student voice can guide teacher professional development and system support. So as we go into the data, I'm inviting you to listen for 4 things. First, we test an assumption that often comes up in conversation about gender and school outcomes, and we ask whether the data confirms that assumption or gives us a more complex picture. Second, we listen to how students describe school for themselves, not just as a place of learning, but also as a place where they experience things like challenge, enjoyment, stress, care, belonging. Third, we want to highlight the positive teacher actions that students are already recognizing. And this is important because those qualities of care and listening and encouragement, they're not small things, but they're actually part of inclusive practice. And finally, we look at where those good practices or good experiences are still uneven. So we can think very clearly about what teacher support and system leadership should really strengthen next. So the data is showing areas that need attention, but it's also showing areas where students are already experiencing encouragement, care, etc. And our purpose is to learn from both of these, what is already working and what needs to become more consistent for every learner. My colleague Carrie will continue with some of what that data is showing.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Good. If you can hear, it's 12 o'clock where I am, and so the bell tower outside my office door is just starting to ding our 12 times. My apologies. I wanted to share 6 pieces of evidence that we've been collecting in our most recent data collection activity. So we conducted a survey project with secondary students and also local college students to complement the data we had earlier collected in grade 1 and grade 6 classrooms. And I want to say just quickly to the other researchers out there, all of our research activities are reviewed by an independent research ethics board. All of the students have parental consent to participate. And then we also further ask for student assent. So even if the parent gives permission, we still want to make sure students understand that it's a voluntary activity. So Angel said one of the first things that we've been doing in our data is looking to test some of the assumptions that people have about the poor outcomes experienced by boys in Caribbean and Latin American school settings. So one of the ideas that we hear a lot is that boys receive encouragement to leave school so that they can get a job and start earning money. But the data that we've been collecting in the Eastern Caribbean shows that most students overall felt that they had been encouraged to stay in school by adults. We asked a separate question where we also asked them to rate overall. So they had a slider. In our quantitative world, it produced a number from 0 to 100 of whether they were encouraged to stay or leave in school. Overwhelmingly, most students said that overall they felt encouraged to stay in school. And in fact, there was very little difference between boys and girls. So on a 100-point scale, the average difference between boys and girls' response was only 4 points. So boys aren't, we didn't collect any evidence to suggest that boys are actively receiving encouragement to leave school. One of the interesting questions that we asked was about the words that students would use to describe their school experience. So we asked students to give us 3 words, and that's why the percentages in the table there aren't going to add up to 100%. So it's really encouraging that the top word that students provided was fun. That's great. But I want to highlight that there are other words in the top 10 list that are not as positive. So the words boring, stressful, lonely, required and tiring aren't necessarily the overall feelings that we want students to have about their secondary experience. If you look more closely at the word cloud, there are also some other negative words in there. Draining, depressing, overwhelming, unfair, and confusing are some of the words that I see. So we think it's important to pay attention to students' experience, how they feel about school, how they experience school. And I don't think that we want their overall perception to be things like lonely or depressing or unfair. To dive a little bit deeper about this, we asked a couple of questions about how students were feeling at school and whether they felt supported and cared for. Other questions sort of in this vein, we asked if they felt respected and whether they had friends, etc., to better understand their social emotional experience at school. So the question specifically, because we don't have translation on the slides, so students were asked, at my school, is there a teacher or adult who really cares about me? And then on the right, who listens to me when I have something to say? So if we add up the two right-hand values, the positive responses, almost 60% of students would say that there's a teacher or adult who cares about them and who listens when they have something to say. But what that means is that more than 40% of students in secondary schools don't feel that way. And so we need to really pay attention to the unequal experiences that students might be having at school. We have a large sample size for this study, so we have over 1,100 responses, and what that allows us to do is cross some of the questions and look at the pattern of responses between or across questions. So here I'm showing you the word choices that students gave to describe their school experience by the responses to the previous two questions where they felt a teacher cared about them and a teacher listened when they have something to say. So the results show that students who feel they are cared for and listened to at school are more likely to say that school is fun, more likely to say that school is not, or excuse me, less likely to say that school is boring, less likely to say that school is lonely. So these are important statistical differences. If we look just at the top table, students who felt there was an adult at their school that cared about them were more likely to describe their school experience as important and useful. If we look just at the bottom table, students who feel an adult at their school listens to them were less likely to describe school as hard. So maybe meaning that they were able to ask questions, they were able to get support, in the classroom. We think these in particular are really important findings to communicate to teachers because the data is showing us that how a student feels in the classroom really influences their overall experience at school. We asked students a very direct question about whether they felt girls and boys were treated differently at their school. So we asked this question of both grade 6 students and then also of secondary students. And both girls and boys reported that students were treated differently in their schools. There's a slight softening, I guess, of responses. So between grade 6 and secondary, boys were more likely to change from a yes response to a sometimes response, and girls were more likely to change from a no response in grade 6 to a sometimes response in secondary school. But overall, students are reporting that there are differences in how boys and girls are treated at their schools. A follow-up question to this one was we invited students who gave a sometimes or yes response to say a few words. So there was an open-ended question and we invited them to give an explanation or provide an example of how students were being treated differently. We received 275 responses. And I want to say some of them were just very short, a few words, but we had some students who wrote full paragraphs of very detailed examples. So it's really important that we sort of pay attention to students as they're communicating with us. I'm just going to say a few words about this. Our year 2 report will be coming out shortly, and it will have the full analysis. But I want to highlight a couple of things quickly. So the top theme that came out, both boys and girls reported that boys in schools receive harsher discipline, and they would sometimes receive physical discipline. This is actually linked to what's listed there as number 3, what we label as the boys will be boys double standard. So the comments talked about how boys are able to get away with more. So the sense that there's a bit more leniency, particularly around any sexualized behavior. Boys seem to have more are able to get away with more than girls. But when boys are disciplined in schools, students are telling us that the discipline is more swift and harsher for boys. And this point actually links a little bit to what I have listed there as number 6. So in general, both girls and boys talked about issues when they didn't feel believed or heard or respected by teachers and principals in their schools. But specifically when it came to conflicts, boys reported to us that if there was a perceived conflict between a girl and a boy student at the school, then the girl was always believed to be the one that was correct. So the girl would be heard and the boy's version would be discounted. So it speaks to an overall sense about how boys might be feeling in the classroom. The other couple ones that I'll highlight, so number 2, students highlighted to us instances of favoritism or bias, sometimes by gender, sometimes by socioeconomic group. Like a couple of students referred to their parents' occupation or their last name as being the kinds of favoritism that happened in schools. We had reports of uneven application of dress code, uniform, and hair policies between boys and girls. There was also maybe a bit of a racial component here about the style of hair or the color of skin in how hair and dress code policies were being applied. The last one I want to highlight is the point number 7, overall the idea about care and support for boys. So boys told us that it felt early on a teacher would sort of identify them as slow or not serious about education. And then it didn't seem like they were getting the same kind of help from teachers in their academics. And then on the social emotional side, students reported that boys are expected to be stoic. And so they might not receive the same kind of or the same quality of care and support for emotional needs at school. In a separate qualitative piece that sort of complements this, we had submissions from boys that told us that they're expected to hold their emotions in, even though they had they were experiencing the same ups and downs as girls, which they felt was really challenging in participating in schools. Thank you.
And so as we move from the data to the implications, the key point we want to make is that professional development would become more powerful when it starts with the student experience, because the data doesn't just tell us what students achieve, but it helps us to understand how they experience school. It helps us to understand when students feel encouraged, when they feel cared for or listened to, and where they may be feeling that they're still being overlooked or even being treated unfairly. So the first implication is that professional development should start with student voice and those lived school experiences, because when teachers hear what students say, then the conversation becomes more concrete, and it's not just about a general policy idea or a general principle, it's about real students in real classrooms. The second is about validating these qualities of care, listening, encouragement, and belief as equity practices. So they're not small things, they're not soft skills, they're not extras, they're actually part of the equity practice, because that is what shapes the experiences that students have at school. And the data that we have is helping us to name and value exactly this kind of work that teachers are doing. Now, teachers are already doing powerful inclusive work. But a lot of it is quiet. Some of it is not necessarily appearing in the formal reports, but clearly from the data, we see that the students are noticing it. And if the students are noticing it, then we should be treating it as part of effective teacher practice, and it should be part of what we name as equity practices. The third is about creating the safe spaces for educators to examine those hidden patterns without blame. Because a lot of the gender norms and the school cultural practices will show up in as we see the discipline, classroom roles, the teacher expectations, the student voice, and even the kind of emotional support that students will receive. And a lot of the times, these patterns are not necessarily intentional. Therefore, the teachers would need time to reflect on them honestly and not feel blamed, because feeling blame will create defensiveness. We want them to feel respected, and so that they can reflect on what it is they're seeing as those hidden patterns. So the idea is that the work in teacher professional development needs to be both supportive, but also helping the teachers challenge those norms and stereotypes. The fourth is connected to the innovation work. The teachers would need support to test those small practical changes in their classroom. So they don't need to wait for a full reform before trying something useful. They can test whether it's a new routine, a new way of listening to students, a peer support strategy, etc., which allows them to learn what works in their context, which is really important in the vulnerable context where the imported solutions may not always meet or suit their reality. At the system level, we need to ensure that student voice is not just when there's something going wrong, but how it can be used to provide evidence of school improvement. We need to ensure that the inclusive practices don't depend just on teacher goodwill, but it's actually part of the school practice. And that when teachers test ideas, those ideas are not remaining isolated in the school, but they're part of staff conversations, school improvement practices, etc. And that these are scaled through the education system. And the final is that the qualities of care and fairness are not just based on individual goodwill, but it's actually part of the system-supported practices for equity and inclusion. So, but the central idea or conclusion is that professional development works best when it's building on what teachers are already doing well, where it's helping them to see where their practices are uneven, and when it's supporting the schools and systems to make sure that inclusive practices are reliable for every learner. So right now, I'm pleased to invite Ms. Mavis Joseph, the Chief Education Officer of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The ministry support and leadership of the Full Potential Program has really been exceptional in this country with the involvement of every stakeholder, even parents. So we invite her to just reflect on what this evidence and the Full Potential experience means from a Ministry of Education perspective.
Thank you very much, Angel. And good morning to all. I am pleased to be a part of this session. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. As Angel mentioned, I am Mavis Joseph, newly installed Chief Education Officer in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, just 1 month into the role. So thank you once again. The Ministry of Education in St. Vincent and the Grenadines remain committed to ensuring that every child has access to a quality education in an environment where they feel safe, respected, valued, and able to reach their full potential. Inclusive education is not simply about access. It is about creating learning environments where every student experiences belonging, fairness, and meaningful opportunities to succeed. This commitment is especially important because our classrooms are increasingly diverse. Every learner brings unique strengths, experiences, and challenges. As educational leaders, we have a responsibility to ensure that our systems respond to these differences in ways that promote equity and excellence. The Full Potential Program has aligned well with this national commitment by helping us examine not only what students achieve, but also how they experience learning every day. For example, there's greater integration of subject areas. We have seen innovative projects where the use of agricultural activities, have students exploring and developing their literacy skills by reporting on their projects. We see numeracy being included, as well as TVET skills and the use of technology in recording their activities. My involvement with the Full Potential program from its inception has given me the opportunity to observe its growth from a promising initiative into an important source of evidence for improving teaching and learning. Throughout the program, we have worked closely with teachers, principals, students, and partners to better understand the realities within our schools. This journey has reinforced the importance of listening carefully to those who experience education daily and using that evidence to guide decision-making. As Chief Education Officer, I now view this work not simply as a project, but as an important contributor to our broader efforts to strengthen educational quality across the country. The program has demonstrated that sustainable improvement occurs when evidence, professional learning, and collaborative leadership come together. One of the most encouraging findings from the student surveys is that young people clearly recognize and appreciate teachers who genuinely care about them. Students consistently value teachers who listen attentively, encourage them when they struggle, and encourage them to believe in their abilities. Create classrooms where they feel respected. These relationships matter greatly because students learn best when they feel emotionally safe and supported. The data reminds us that effective teaching extends beyond delivering content. It includes building trust, demonstrating empathy, maintaining high expectations, and creating positive classroom environments where every learner feels seen and valued. These findings affirm the excellent work already taking place in many of our classrooms and provide encouragement for teachers who intentionally place students at the center of their practice. At the same time, the evidence also challenges us to continue improving. Students have highlighted areas where they'd like to experience greater fairness, stronger opportunities for student voice, more effective responses to bullying, increased attention to emotional well-being, more gender-responsive teaching practices, and a stronger sense of belonging within their schools. These findings remind us that inclusion is an ongoing process rather than a final destination. While significant progress has been made, we must continue creating learning environments where every child feels heard, respected, and confident that they matter. The student voice data provides valuable direction for where our collective efforts should focus moving forward. And this is an area that the Ministry of Education sees as priority and will be seeking to provide more opportunities for students to air their views. And we're looking at things like student councils, public speaking, etc. The program has also highlighted what teachers need if they are to sustain inclusive and equitable practices. Teachers require time to reflect on their practice, practical tools, and support implementation opportunities for safe professional dialogue. One particularly encouraging aspect of the Full Potential program has been the teacher innovation component. Teachers use student voice and evidence gathered from their classrooms to identify challenges, test practical solutions, reflect on the outcomes, and refine their approaches. This process empowered teachers to become innovators, within their own classroom rather than simply implementers of external ideas. The Ministry of Education appreciates the networking and the emerging communities of practice among teachers based on these innovations. The evidence gathered from the Full Potential Program should continue to inform our professional development programs, school improvement planning, principal leadership development, and future policy decisions. We also see significant value in identifying and scaling promising practices that have emerged from participating schools. Teacher innovations grounded in evidence and responsive to student needs. Practical models that can benefit schools across the country. So as we move forward, our focus will remain on strengthening collaborative learning among educators, supporting evidence-informed decision-making, and ensuring that every learner experiences an education system where they can thrive academically, socially, and emotionally. The Full Potential Program has reminded us that meaningful educational improvement begins by listening to our students, supporting our teachers, and working together to create schools where every child can realize their full potential. I do thank you for listening, and I'll just allow you to hear a 1-minute presentation from our Minister of Education. Thank you very much.
Porque no podemos escuchar. No se logra escuchar.
We cannot hear the presentation.
Departments, SEO. I'm big on innovation. And back to fact, our ministry is also the Ministry of Innovation. And I want principals, teachers, heads of departments, SEOs, who are important and part of the education enterprise, to feel free to create the space, innovate in ways that will help students succeed at what they're doing, and building teamwork, and which is very important. So let it be known, as Minister of Education, Vocational Training, Innovation, Digital Transformation and Information, we want an education service where our educators feel free to experiment, to innovate, to learn from their innovation. Let us take risks that would enhance our students' experience, build their confidence, and also provide an environment for them to achieve their full potential.
Muchísimas, pero muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Angel, Carrie. Your presentation was very relevant. What you have just mentioned, the importance of paying attention to what students express and considering the voice of students and moving this towards the teachers, the schools. Thank you so much, Mavis, for your great comments. I keep that comment that this evidence was used to make decisions, and also to the Ministry Jackson for all his support. Thank you so much. Now I would like to move to the next block, and here we invite Dominga Rios. She is a psychologist and magister in education, in educational policy and school management. She has worked in research, in school managing, accompanying to different communities. Her main focus of interest are related to innovation for learning and for the territorial sustainability and educational trajectories. She's currently the director of educational policy in the Foundation to Education 2020. She will share with us the findings about all this project, about tutoring among peers, peer tutoring for equitable rural education. And Dominga, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you very much, Rosa, for your presentation, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my presentation now. First of all, I would like to thank this opportunity.
Sí, sí, la vemos perfecto.
Thank you, Rosa. So again, I want to thank this opportunity of being here with the GPA KIX community. This network knows about the challenges of improving education in a high vulnerability context. I want to greet all the colleagues from the programs that have been presented and developed, and also to our counterparts, and also to IDRC, SUMMA, and the OECS. It's a pleasure for me to share with you this presentation. I'm going to try to finish it in the time that was allocated for my presentation. So this is a program, a long-term program that follows the adaptation of a model in order to work in the Honduras context. In this first instance, they adopted this tutoring model from a located perspective, and from that instance, they created this training pilot. And in this opportunity, I would like to talk to you about this third phase that considered the scalability of the program and the institutionalization with the Pedagogic University, Francisco de Morazan, and I will have the later comments from Dr. Leticia Paz, Director of the Curriculum Development of the University. So I wanted to present how we organize this presentation. There is this context that maybe many of you know, why Honduras, and I also want to tell you about this strategy. In the second part of the presentation, I will tell you about the innovation program that we worked in Honduras and what was the adaptation that we followed based on the located experience that we had in the first instance of the program. And third, I wanted to share with you our thoughts, our reflection from the GPA KIX team, considering how these strategies will contribute to promote education environments that are more inclusive and more equitative. And then with Dr. Carla Paz, we will tell you about the perspectives from its point of view, from the institutional achievements that we reached in the development of the program, and also their projections for the sustainable continuity in Honduras. So first of all, talking about the context, I think you may know this, but I thought it was important to refer this information about the country and also the strategic actors we worked with. Here, I highlighted some figures that will help us understand the challenge that Honduras faces and with whom we work in this experience. I wanted to highlight that 52% of students that are in secondary school, they continue this, unlike 95% of students who maintain their school level in the primary school. So this is an important challenge in terms of retention of students for the secondary education. So in spite of the 90% of coverage in primary school, and with this reduction in the secondary school, the next figure shows that there is still a challenge in terms of the levels, because 70% of students have a low level in terms of reading and mathematics. Along with this, there is this third figure that shows the challenge of the program, that is that less than 1% of teachers that have been trained and are working in Honduras have access to the continuous training. So this scenario shows the big challenges experienced by the country. Although they have had some progress in mathematics, this progress were seen in 2019, but they reduced the percentage of achievement in reading and in attendance. So although they have tried to progress in the training formation or for teachers in the universities, but they haven't met this challenge. And also there is a lot of instability in the political system that has had an impact in the education and in the teams of work. So there was this strategic adjustment in order to work with the pedagogic university. And why this university? The reason is because this university has a strategic role in Honduras. There are only two institutions enabled to train teachers. One of them is the University Francisco de Morazá. 95% of the public sector of teachers have graduated from this university. It's a very important university in order to work in aspects such as training and the improvement of the TPD. I also wanted to add something else. In 2025, the university started a curriculum reform process that was something that created or generated the results that I will share with you later. So, in the context of the innovation program, I just wanted to highlight or to give you a brief description of the model. The strategic actors were us, the university, and the counterpart who would be the ones that allowed us to have this conference. We worked with 19 teachers from the university, 56 students of pedagogy, and 36 students that were doing their first internship in real schools or classrooms. Here we see the methodology, the peer tutoring that was created in Mexico. This was installed as a methodology from the community knowledge, from the popular knowledge, from the education in the margins of schools. And also they brought this to Chile 1 decade ago, and it also adapted to the Chilean educational model with all the adequations of the country or required by the country. What's the main characteristic of this methodology? I could define this in 4 pillars. First one, a horizontality relationship or horizontal relationship that is encouraged through the mediation among peers, where the tutor is the one that accompanies or guiding and mediating this learning space, where they generate a learning environment that is sustainable in terms of affection or in terms of with the person that is going to be the tutoree. And here we have the an active question. That's the second pillar. Here the questions develop the learning route between the tutor and the tutoree, and they accompany this in this specific theme. The third pillar is the metacognition. We know it's key in any learning process. In this, here you plan a moment in which the tutoree reflect about what he or she learned. That could last 2 hours or different hours, depending on the curiosity or the questions. And in the last minute of this tutoring, they have this phase of metacognition in which they revise what they have learned, how they have learned, and then continue learning from yourself on how you learn and what I should consider when learning. And the fourth pillar that was mentioned here, and that is related to the pedagogic dialogue. This is the main driver of this tutor experience, allowing this interaction in which the tutor leads this experience according to the interest, to the questions, and the curiosity of the student. Having this previous planning that defines these progressive learning challenges that will set like the key milestones of this journey, of this route, depending on who the tutoree is. So now, how do we develop our this program in terms of phases and strategy? We appoint here that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we had this adapted model based on the Honduras reality, and they created four great phases, or four big phases. First one was the first year where Education 2020 transferred capacities to a group one of leaders from the university. This stage is called the training of training teachers. Then we move towards a second phase in which this group one of leaders will train initial students or students in initial education. So they have a second ring of tutors. Then they move towards a third phase where these students transfer this experience to real schools when they are going to develop their learning experience. And from the second group, we have a third group, which are the students from school, and then a fourth phase, which is about assessment and adjustments, where we have different levels, where the initiative is divided, and we see other cohorts where we deep dive in the strategy. So the first group teachers are going to train a new cohort, and the students that are practicing or that are teaching in the schools, they can train other students. And I would like to tell you about, let me check the time. So I would like to tell you about the results. What is it that we obtain or what we got from these different voices and perspectives? In this slide, you will see that I organized the different voices that represent the different actors that participated in this program. First of all, from the experience of the practitioners that allowed us to observe this. So in terms of methodology, I could deep dive in the details. So we had focus groups, surveys, interviews, and after analyzing the results, what we obtained was how these practitioners see the resignification of teaching as a process of questions and active listening. So the role of questions is very important in the experience that these students reported in the university, to the university. Also, the confidence as a space that is generated from the socio-affective characteristics was a key condition for learning, which is consistent with the structure of the pedagogic structure that considers the learning environment as a space where they work at the beginning of the tutoring. You cannot start the tutoring without establishing a confidence moment, a safe environment in order to develop the tutoring. And what were the challenges here? First, to strengthen the metacognition. Although we could work on metacognition, we realized that it was challenging for the practitioners and for the tutoree. In order to explain how I think, it's easier, apparently, to identify what I have learned instead of how I learned this. What was easier, what was more difficult, and this requires accompanying from the professionals. The second result, and this is mainly focused in this group, the group number 1, and I want you to pay close attention to this because I will tell you about this in the next slide. Because this group 1, this training group, they showed a very important value, or they rescued the culture of asking questions. So I want to highlight what the analysis shows us, how the trainers acknowledge that they became, or that they were receptacles of this methodology, because they were told they would be group number 1, and then they became builders of the located pedagogic knowledge. So this turned them into a very passive receptor or receptacle into a very active builder of this knowledge. And I think this shows the value of this study, and this shows or confirms that this dialogic experience is not only the drive of learning, but development of the located knowledge. I'm going to deep dive in the next slide. So from the supervisors of these practices, what they observed after the study or during the study is how these supervisors had a more critical and empathetic posture when they were seeing their students or their practitioners. They observed them with sensitivity in relation to their capacities to perform their skills. And here, this is related to time and to the administrative burden, not only for supervisors, but also for the practitioners that were developing these tutor practices, that we know that under a school context, sometimes the schedule is quite fit, or is quite tight, I'm sorry, and where we saw that this administrative burden would complicate or would make this more difficult. So we had this experience of these children that were receiving this experience where we work in rural schools, multi-rate rural schools, and we observed the experience of the program. And the methodology transcended the first, or went beyond this first experience, and spontaneously some children replicated their gift with other school peers. So that the hypothesis or the initial intentionality of this strategy, but here we didn't intend to do this, and that wasn't the direct goal of this, but nonetheless, this was seen as a valuable result that we didn't expect.
Just to dive a little bit deeper in what I'm telling you about the trainers, that we saw this relevant difference between the group of trainers, group 1, that later trained the students that became tutors. I would like you to look at the 4th bar here. We have 4 bars in this slide. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention something. So, talking about this particular outcome, I would like to share some quantitative outcome we had. We couldn't have a control group, which means that there are some boundaries for how we can interpret this study. But what we can do is actually compare the different groups we compared with, to compare what was the point of view pre-training and after the training. Of course, there are methodological limitations here, but we do believe we can come to some conclusions, we can infer some things based on the results in the different groups. You see the change there from gray to blue. In all the groups, we saw that they were valuing this strategy of the tutoring. They also thought this model was actually making a difference when it came to teaching. So basically, the beliefs, the trainers that were training the new trainers had some beliefs that we're actually transforming, thinking about what happened before and after the test. So what I'm saying is that we saw differences in all groups, but those trainers that were training others were valuing the training even more because they saw how this innovative experience allows them to change their own beliefs on the strategy. So we believe this converses with the qualitative aspect of the study because the trainers themselves realize that this more passive attitude they saw at the beginning of the strategy, at the beginning of the implementation, did change with the active experience and the use of the questions after the implementation of the program. You need to wrap up, Dominga. Sorry, go ahead. You have 1 more minute. All right, thank you. So another relevant value of what we see here is how this curriculum becoming more institutional. This was part of the strategy that was implemented, and that allows us to learn that scaling up the program is not just getting to more people, but also dive deeper in the work with a partner institution. So now I will go to the conclusions. So those who were part of the program perceived the change. They reported they were highly satisfied. So we cannot prove anything, but the study does allow us to infer that there were changes in beliefs and practices based on this self-reflection. And we also saw how this became institutionalized when you had the willingness and these strategies were included as part of the university curriculum. And hence, we believe that this is a model we could replicate in other educational contexts, and that this systematic support was identified as the one that allows them to learn even more. So it's basically the heart of the strategy. Just a few final ideas before yielding the floor to Carla Paz. We have these guide questions for reflection. So even though we were not focusing on equity and inclusion directly, it wasn't a variable we were measuring, I would like to mention 3 key elements. On the side of teachers, and with this I'm wrapping up, Rosa. So when it comes to teacher professional development, we analyze the experience critically, and we believe that the strategy allows us to diversify how you teach in the classroom because you adapt materials for the level and interest of the different students. You can also adapt when you're thinking about challenges in the future, so you can be more flexible to reach the different outcomes, to tackle those challenges. We believe that the strategy mobilizes beliefs. It allows you to compare what's common and what's different within the classroom. And it also provides teachers with a reflection on their own mistakes as a tool for ongoing improvement in their teaching practices. It also provides with the scaffolding to mobilize beliefs, thinking about the active learning of students. And I think I talked about this before. I think the result is clear. So the strategy protects the interest of students, but it also promotes their autonomy, the role of questions and metacognition as a skill that needs to be developed, and also provides this climate that is safe in terms of social aspects and emotions. And thinking about the contents of the learning experience, we see that it goes on a spiral, how you learn, because this makes learning easier. It provides new meaning to the learning experience, which is important because many students believe that they won't be able to reach some learnings or get that knowledge. And this tutoring strategy shows that you can move these beliefs that used to be fixed, meaning that it's more universally accessible. And this is not just related to the level of coverage or the number of students, but also with the learning experience of each student individually, which is also enriched by this collaboration between different disciplines to foster learning. That was it. Now I'd like to yield the floor to Carla.
Muchísimas gracias, Dominga.
Thank you so much,
Claro,
Dominga.
adelante, Carlita, Carla.
And Carla,
Pues,
the floor is yours.
primero, antes que nada, quisiera decir
But
que nos quedamos
before,
con la impresión de que
I just wanted
fue una
to
combinación, un
say
verdadero reto tener
that it's clear that
esos resultados de
it
los
was
estudiantes y
challenging,
tener
right, to
maestros
obtain
que
those
tienen
results from
acceso a formación
students
continua.
and also having teachers that have no
Realmente un reto
access
para ustedes.
to teacher professional development, to continuing professional development. That is a challenge for you. So now I'd like to listen to Carla Paz, who's in charge of curriculum at the university. Carla, please go ahead. Good morning, Rosa Maria. Good morning to Dominga and everybody joining us today. Thank you for the opportunity to make some comments about the work we've been conducting as a university with the 2020 Foundation. So from the point of view of collaboration, reflection, and this community that analyzes its own practices. As Dominga mentioned, one of the benefits of TEPA at the university and for initial teacher training, our university is the one in charge of training those new teachers for the 3 different levels of education in Honduras. So the Autonomous University of Honduras trains teachers, but our university is focused on initial teacher training so they can work at the 3 different levels we have in the country. So it came at a key moment, this project, for our university, because we are going through this transition that has to do with the reform of the university, the 5th one. So there are changes in its organizational structure, but also in the educational model. For the first time, the university included in its educational model an initial teacher training model, and this framework for teaching. The country was already trying to coordinate initial training and continuing training, so we could have a framework with the different skills and outcomes that might show us what we expect to have when finishing the training process, right? As this framework of teaching best practices. So for our university, having this project, the TEPA, gave us a way to bring that initial teacher training model into practice based on reflection, on analyzing practices critically, and as Dominga also mentioned, this training for educational inclusion. One of the key findings of the analysis of the curriculum was that our graduates were saying that current profiles from the university had that gap that had to do with considering the diversity of students. So the project became a real practice on how to produce this inclusion and equity processes. Why? Because of the methodology and its characteristics, and Dominga already talked about that. This open dialogue, this idea of a community, that we have no hierarchy here, that we all can learn together, and that learning comes from anybody, regardless of their age, their beliefs. This is a knowledge mobilization principle that is quite relevant. And in that sense, through the project, we were able to develop this pedagogical practice that actually complies with the principle of inclusion. It's not just about students being there, their presence, but also removing barriers and also their engagement in the process itself. So as Dominga said, the university was able to institutionalize this curriculum for pedagogy with this work between peers through different devices. So for the first time, we had available for all of our students a subject that focuses on inclusion. It's called inclusive theory and practices, and it also includes TEPA, this methodology of this tutoring between peers, the general aspects of it. And then to dive deeper, there's a specific course for those students who would like to learn more about the principles and the characteristics of this methodology. As Dominga said before, one has to do with metacognition. Throughout the implementation, we came to realize that students were able to implement these practices as part of their routine work, and there's not much reflection on the actual results or outcomes of an educational practice in the learning process. So thanks to this cycle, we were able to understand how we should implement TEPA in our practice. This is also very good because for the first time, the university has this practice model that goes on different stages, and it is actually reflexive. So basically, we came up with this pilot for innovation in the classroom, and we are also able to see how students in their own practice can make use of these inclusive teaching practices. And I'm sure many of you know that the university also has a continuing professional development department, and the foundation also does some work in this. So we have our remote platform with a course that is already online to learn about TEPA, so we can drive this continuing professional development through these strategies for teacher professional development, for primary education, early education, computing for education, and other fields to support the professionalization of the practice. I should also say that through this program, the university was able to develop and build capacities for these trainers that are training others. We were able to adapt the methodology to the initial teacher training. The program that Educación 2020 had already implemented in the country through the Ministry of Education. And thanks to TEPA, we were able to provide this new methodology with the project we were implementing with the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB, to train hundreds of rural teachers with this methodology, with this teacher core Dominga talked about. They were able to strengthen their skills in what was called number one. And another relevant thing is that this is not an isolated project. It is a methodology that is embedded in our plans, and we are implementing it for the second year. And I should also say that TEPA is a potential source for knowledge mobilization. We have published 3 articles in indexed magazines on TEPA, one focusing on the construction of the tools, how we built the tools that we use for the project. We have been part of 5 conferences internationally talking about the findings Dominga already mentioned. And the project was also chosen by the Milton Foundation as a successful project. And we were also invited to this Higher Education Council of Central America to talk about this methodology, which is an innovative practice of the university. And as I said before, it has been a great and wonderful opportunity for a university to train for reflection, to build these communities of practice, to have a community of practice reflecting on the teaching process and how we train teachers, which is something we've been wanting to do for a while, and it has been quite useful to include TEPA in our professional practice as part of our reform. It's called the teaching practicum, but it goes beyond a different name, right? We are trying to show that this is a process that connects a practice and theory to have the situated experiences. And I believe that TEPA and the project in the past few years has produced a relevant impact in how we build knowledge, both for initial teacher training, but also, and as Dominga said already, it reaffirms the evidence produced by research that it does have a huge impact in children. As Dominga said, we weren't expecting trainers to train students as tutors, and they were able to do that in this area that's close to the capital city of Honduras. So this reaffirms the knowledge we have been able to produce under TEPA and the impact it has in this concept of self-efficacy of children themselves, that they are involved in their learning processes and in teaching. And of course, this is a key element of inclusion, not just having students there, but having them engaged and happy and wanting to learn more. So to summarize, we could say that thinking about initial teacher training, TEPA has provided us with the opportunity to build these reflexive communities of practice, to bring our initial teacher training to build this reflexive practice with these questions, these powerful questions for reflection that now we are able to ask. And it has also meant that the university has been able to produce scientific knowledge that they can share with other educational communities in other universities. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Carla, for those comments. And I would like to focus on what you were saying, that having scale is not just about being there, but also about preparing these powerful questions for reflection. We are running out of time, but we have a couple of questions for the first team, the team from St. Lucia. And this question comes from Nigeria. Did teachers feel they were being adequately remunerated? So they were actually providing these inclusive practices? They were actually committed to it because they felt they were being fairly compensated? That's a question for any of the three people in charge of that project.
Well, I can respond. There was no remuneration for instance, for participating in the training. What we really relied on and we noticed was teachers' own motivation to do well for the students, to support the students as fully as possible. And exploring these concepts of equity, inclusion, norms, and so on was a new approach for them to consider what might be impacting their practice and what might be impacting student learning. And so that internal motivation they had really drove them to participate in this training. In addition to that, the format of professional dialogues, which was a change from the traditional approach to professional development, where someone came and spoke to them and told them what they were doing and what they should do. The professional dialogue really centered their own experiences, their own stories, and it used the data that came from their classrooms and their schools that really kept them engaged. In terms of any remuneration, the innovation process, one of the key stages is prototyping or testing out their ideas, their solutions, and we encourage low cost or no cost prototyping, but they do have access to small grants that could help them do that prototyping. So teacher teams who were doing an innovation work had access to those funds. Interestingly, we found that although that initially motivated a lot of teacher teams to try out innovation, when they got to the stage of prototyping, most of their prototypes were no cost. So they did not even access these funds. And we have teachers, including one who's actually on the conference today, who has been participating in that teacher-led innovation process since 2021. So we see the internal motivation is there. We also have them engaging in knowledge mobilization of their own practice, of their own evidence, and that is an additional form of incentive for them to participate. I don't know if Carrie or anyone wants to add anything to that, but...
Perfect. In honor to time, I think it's great that you have an answer that it was more motivation than remuneration. So thank you so much. Tengo una pregunta más para...
I have another question for Dominga. Is this active learning strategy of tutoring that TEPA uses, is it connected to the tandem method? That's a question for either Carla or Dominga.
El método tandem.
The tandem method, is it connected to your active learning process? Thank you so much, Rosa, for the question. I could say that looking at different innovations, you can find some commonalities, but I would say that initially the answer is no. This methodology was developed in Mexico and now it's being adapted to different countries in the Americas. We have done some work in Chile, Peru, Honduras, and maybe I'm forgetting another country right now. So it uses key elements that might be similar to other innovations, but are actually part of this peer tutoring that comes from this experience in the south of Mexico. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dominga. And to our audience, please, if you have any additional questions, send those questions to KIX LAC, and we will be happy to share those questions with the different projects. Thank you so much for your comments, for the presentations, the reflections, and everything we have experienced today, this morning. It's been a long meeting, so we believe it's now time to wrap up. We would like to ask you to fill out the survey that we will share with you in the chat. It's in the 3 languages, English, Spanish, and French. We would like to hear your thoughts so we can improve the activities we organize. And we would like to thank you all, Dante, Nelsy, Francisco, Ericka, Nelsy, Cristina, Brad, Angel, Carrie, Dominga, and Carla for your time today and for the time you dedicated to this audience. SUMMA is renovating its commitment after 10 years to continue transforming educational system in Latin America and the Caribbean with the excellency and the rigor and the context and collaboration we can contribute from what we do to move forward to a more fair and equitable education in Latin America. Hopefully tomorrow we'll be able to talk about the adaptation of educational systems in vulnerable contexts. But before we say goodbye, we would like to ask you to turn on your camera so we can take a group picture. Once again, thank you so much and see you tomorrow. That's a beautiful picture. Our colleagues from the communications department take those pictures. We would like to thank all of you who were translating into English, Spanish, and French, to our entire KIX team and all the projects that have been working since day one in our KIX LAC program. Thank you once again and congratulations. Have a